You're muted, Lars, but okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Anurag.
Thanks. And really quickly, again, I'll introduce the project team to everyone. So SCAG is leading the study. We've got a really good multidisciplinary team behind us and supporting us in our efforts. Cambridge Systematics is the lead consultant on the project. We've also got CR Associates, ICF, Red Hill Group, Tioga, and the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So we've got a great team assembled. And we're hoping with your support as well, we'll get some great results out of this study. And the other thing is that we do have a pretty great TAC team assembled as well. I think we've got pretty much everyone from the last meeting present, as well as a couple of new participants that we've added since then. So we've got GoBiz, the Ventura County Air Pollution Control District, the California Public Utilities Commission, and Wally Baker. So we want to welcome you. We look forward to your support in pulling this study together, and really appreciate any input or participation that you can give. And then just the last thing, we'll just give a quick overview of the agenda. So we've kind of gotten through the welcome and introductions. I'm going to hand it off to Anurag in a moment, but he'll go over the project phasing and a recap of the last TAC meeting. We'll give you an update on progress to date, some of the surveys we've been doing and modeling. We're going to go over some of the stakeholder engagement themes that we've seen come out of the surveys. We've got a few steps for TAC engagement. We've got some poll questions for you, and then we'll just have some open discussion. Any questions you've got. We're going to have opportunities for people to either ask questions directly during a break, or you can always raise your hand. We can call on you, or you can drop a question in the chat. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll do our best to make sure we answer those as best we can, either during the presentation or in the chat as well. But we really do want to encourage your participation. I think that's really critical to the success of this study as well. And if you do put something in the chat, maybe just include your name and organization if you're new to the TAC, just so we can, we know exactly where every question is coming from. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it off to Anurag. But again, just want to reiterate, happy to be here, happy to learn from everyone, and looking forward to next steps.
Jonathan, thank you for the introduction. Hi, I'm Anurag Kamanduri. I'm the overall consultant project manager. I'm with Cambridge Systematics. Good to see everybody. We've got I'm glad so many of you have come back to part of meeting number 2. We have a few new members. It's really exciting to be here. We have done quite a bit of work between TAC 1 and 2. So I'll talk a little bit of this. I'll give a bit of recap. And then between me, Sam, and Lars, we'll just talk through the key aspects that the team has been working on. Lars, if you could advance. So just as a reminder, there are 3 phases to this project. The first phase, which is where we are right now, is a lot of literature review and outreach programs. And the outreach has taken multiple forms. But there have been interviews, there have been focus groups, there have been surveys, which I'll talk briefly. There's been a lot of technical work on the data analytics side, as Jonathan mentioned, to push through what we believe is sort of a good baseline understanding of truck movement in Southern California, and what are the challenges that we're going to face when we talk about electrifying those movements. And then ultimately phase 3, which is future forward, is start identifying these public charging locations where we can all commit to as we build this blueprint for Southern California. Next slide. Just again, a bit more detail, just for those of you who are new, and for those of you, just as a reminder, who have been with us since TAC meeting 1, of what each of these phases entail. We have started, we're still in the middle of phase 1, but we are starting to think about getting into phase 2, where we go a little bit beyond existing conditions and start thinking about what all of these mean as we start the critical work of developing the blueprint in phase 2 and 3. We have also a schedule of when we believe the TACs may happen. November, December, we're always sensitive given the holiday, so we'll plan this well in advance. But you see, with things start getting tighter, because we do expect the team is now gearing up. We have done a lot of the outreach, so we'll start looking inwards, which means we can control the schedule a little bit more. We can control the flow of work. And so you'll see 3 and 4 on the TACs sort of scrunch together a little bit more. But again, glad you're here. I hope to see you on the next 4 TACs as well. Quick reminder on TAC 1, on the next slide, please. Here is a recap. It was held a few months ago, mid-July 2023. We had 25 plus organizations participating, and we heard great conversations, a lot of interest, and a lot of viewpoints. We sort of laid out the overview of the project and how the project team was planning to schedule and tackle it. And then we heard from the TAC members, both during the TAC meeting and also extensively afterwards, because you're all the experts in this space. A lot of you are working pretty actively at various aspects of this implementation as we move into the next phase, moving into zero emission future. And you also recommended some members to add to the TAC, and you'll see some changes based on that. So again, very appreciative, and we learned a lot, certainly, at the end of TAC 1. And then on the next slide, please. We came up with 4 key action items, or 4 next steps that we said we would do. If you go to the next slide, we said we would continue outreach, which we have done. Thank you again for participating. We would do a lot of technical work and data analytics, which we'll present today. We'll start to integrate those findings from the outreach and the data analysis together to start identifying what the future scenarios may look like. This is a work in progress. And we also committed to showing with you today some of the initial and also some robust findings from the first 2 bullet points that we discussed. With that, I will pass it to the Deputy Project Manager of the project, Sam Znaimer, to talk a little bit more about the progress and where we are. Sam?
Thank you so much, Anurag. And as Anurag said, I'm Sam Znaimer. I'm with Cambridge Systematics, and I'm the Deputy Project Manager on this one. And Lars, if you could advance to the next slide. And part of my role, besides being Deputy Project Manager, is helping lead the outreach portion of this project. So I was lucky enough to help lead some of our TAC meetings, our helping support our truck survey, focus groups, and interviews. Also, while I wasn't part of it, our technical team was able to make significant progress in terms of completing truck GPS data analysis. They've completed the truck trip expansion, which they'll go into detail on in a few slides further on. They started identifying the market segments and incorporating payload information to get a better understanding of where commodities are going, where trucks are going, and an understanding of how that impacts moving forward. Next slide, please. I'm going to go into a little bit more about the outreach to date. Obviously, this is the second TAC meeting. Thank you all so much for participating. Additionally, on top of the TAC meetings, we have had over 100 survey participants for our truck fleet survey. We've conducted 11 interviews for both public and private stakeholders, and we've conducted 3 focus groups, both public and private stakeholders as well. Obviously, a number of you participated in the focus group and interview process, and so that was a great help in understanding a lot of the barriers and challenges we're facing. And we'll talk more about those themes in terms of what we heard from both the interviews and focus groups a little later, while we talk about the engagement themes and lead into our the TAC engagement portion of the presentation. Right now, I'm going to cover a little bit more about our fleet survey that we conducted. The survey was conducted by Red Hill Group, led by Mark McCord. Him and his team were able to reach out to a number of different size of truck fleet operators to gain a lot of important information that we're utilizing to better understand who's operating within Southern California, where are they going, and how can this information be applied to our understanding of zero emissions technology and how much it's gone into our trucking fleets throughout Southern California. Lars, if you could go to the next slide. So one of the first questions you have to ask whenever you're doing a survey is who's being surveyed. So our process was to reach out to a number of Southern California-based trucking organizations through a number of different lists provided to us by public sector clients, as well as our other lists that we were able to develop as part of our outreach process. So as you can tell here, we reached out to over 100 different participants, and the fleet ranges where they varied greatly. Some as small as 1 to 4 fleet, so owner-operator type fleets, and then all the way up to 100 plus fleet. size of different truck operations. So we wanted to make sure we got the gambit. While we did focus a bit more on, as you can see, the respondents kind of fell in more within the 1 to 50 range. So a lot more smaller setups participated in the survey. So it's important to note that while we're thinking about representation. Additionally, thinking about where or what organizations or what industries they're connected to. The primary respondents were both in transportation and warehousing as they identified themselves. There were others in construction, manufacturing, agriculture. So we did want to get a good spread of representation, but it's still skewed obviously towards our transportation side and warehousing. And that might be due to the nature of Southern California, where we're really focusing our outreach efforts. If you go to the next slide, Lars. Great, thank you. Additionally, we wanted to understand their travel patterns a little bit better. So we wanted to ask where are their common destinations, and not surprisingly, as you saw from there, warehousing and distribution centers were the most common, followed by ports, as well as a lot of other services, retail outlets, so obviously other to market goods. Additionally, we wanted to better understand where do they primarily travel. We saw a number of the ones that we interviewed travel within Southern California, but we also see that there's also nationwide representation as well as beyond Southern California. So all these fleets do operate within Southern California as part of our outreach tactic, but we also saw that some of the people we talked to operate well with outside of Southern California, throughout the state, throughout the West Coast, and even nationwide. So a decent spread, but still primarily in Southern California. The next slide, Lars. We also wanted to understand how many trips they were, or how many stops they were making throughout the day, and their overall mileage that they encumbered throughout the day to better understand how they operated. So we were getting a good amount of different feedback. The primary number of stops that we saw was 2 to 5, and then quickly followed by 6 to 10. And so that gives us a better understanding of how many stops that these types of fleets were making throughout the day, and gives a better relation to the data that we'll be looking at as I will cover in the next set of slides. Lars, if you go to the next slide. And then obviously, as the point of this study is to really thinking about zero emissions planning, one of the first questions we wanted to ask was, where are they now in terms of starting that transition, or when would they likely start that transition to zero emissions vehicles? And what we saw was there was a number of people that were already looking at that process, and they were looking at primarily replacing vehicles that are at the end of their economic life. And as you saw from our previous slides, a lot of the people that we talked to were some of the smaller fleets. So this may be a representation to some of the challenges that we'll discuss further, but it is a good thing to remember that the primary audience that we talked to, while we did cover a good gambit of different fleet sizes, were smaller fleet sizes. So that may impact the idea of when they're going to actually start the transition to zero emissions vehicles. Lars, next slide. And then we want to expand that to get a better understanding of not only when they're thinking about it, but what actions have they actually done to get towards zero emissions trucks. Sorry about that. And we can see that a lot of companies did a number of different things. And on a future slide, we'll show it as a breakdown of the size of fleets. But importantly, we can see that there have been a number of actions done, especially by our larger fleets. And we'll be able to detail that out a little bit better. But we saw in our response data that a number of the larger fleets have plans, they have estimated budgets, they've already started looking at infrastructure, securing it. So larger fleets are a bit ahead of the smaller fleets, which I don't think is a shock to anybody. Obviously, we know that this issue in terms of getting EV, there's a big funding component. There are other types of barriers that larger organizations may be better posed to take on at this point in time in the early adoption of ZEV vehicles. One of the things we really wanted to specifically, sorry if you could go back to that slide, to see what they've done is if they've talked to utilities or if they've talked to manufacturers. And we can see while many have started the process of talking to vehicle manufacturers, talking to utilities is a much further step. And that may also be a representation of, again, the smaller fleet sizes that may not be as poised to do in-depot charging setups at this point in time. So looking at the vehicles before the charging systems or bringing charging to site would make a lot of sense for some of these smaller setups. So the next slide, Lars. And this also, we're thinking about that question of where will charging or fueling infrastructure be installed? And this is more of a question of, will it be on site or will it be at another location? And what we're seeing, at least from what we've pulled, is that there were, in terms of the electric vehicle charging, more of them thought it was very likely and somewhat likely to have it on site. Whereas for hydrogen, they found it very unlikely. So understanding those two different fuel types, or I should say different types of fueling alternatives, we're seeing that more of the fleets were thinking about electric charging on site, and less of them were thinking about hydrogen on site, at least at this point in time. Next slide. And then we also want to ask them about what they saw in terms of barriers to a zero emissions trucking future. Some of the ones that they pointed out, the first and foremost one was the vehicle purchase cost itself. So again, funding came up. Another one related directly to the vehicles themselves, where they were worried about the range limitations. So as we saw, a lot of trips are being made over a large period of, over a large distance, and that is definitely worrying some of our fleets. Another big one was the grid readiness and infrastructure costs. So those two things can go hand in hand in many cases, but also still reflect some of the biggest challenges that we heard in our interviews and in our focus groups. Additionally, when we looked at, we asked the question about which type of fueling technology they're looking at, we still saw predominantly that others thought, or that the trucking fleets thought they would be going towards electric, though there was almost 15% of people who were looking at hydrogen. So again, it's showing that there is still an opportunity to educate, as many did not know. Some were looking at both and some were looking at neither. But more importantly, the don't know was such a significant portion. It's important to think about that as we continue our education process moving forward, about which one might be, or which fuel types might be helpful during this transition. Next slide, Lars. And one of the other questions we want to know, obviously, we saw costs and funding being such a significant barrier, and also something that was brought up multiple times during the interview process, that we wanted to understand better if people knew about the existing support that's out there via our incentives, both California incentives as well as federal. And as we can see, many people have heard of them, but are not familiar with their details. So again, another opportunity where education could potentially help defeat one of our major barriers, which is funding. Obviously, we know that there is only so much money in incentives, but we also know that they are a great benefit to people trying to make the transition. So potentially the education and just the notices around them can be improved as we move forward, obviously, as we're charting this course towards 2045. Next slide, Lars. And I did want to highlight this slide. Obviously, we think it's important to think about where are each of these kind of fleet sizes in relation to these barriers and the understanding of where they are in the planning. So as you can see here, it's a little bit hard, and obviously there's a lot of colors going on. But what this slide is showing us is that a lot of the smaller fleets are showing that those challenges are persistent throughout all of the different categories in terms of different challenges. So it looks like it presents a bit harder on them, or they recognize it as being a more significant challenge. Additionally, the none of the above in terms of, the other chart we're showing here, it's important to look at the none of the above because it is the prominent element. But from the color shading, you can see the 1 to 4 and 5 to 10, and even up to 11, 19 actually make up a significant portion of the people who haven't done anything yet, or none of the above in terms of different steps in moving to that transition. So again, something to think about with our smaller fleets, showing that they are either slightly behind where larger fleets are in the process, or even that some of the barriers may be more impactful to them because of their small size and the higher level of cost associated with all of these different elements that go into zero emissions vehicle charging future. And with that, I'm going to transfer this, send this back to Anurag to talk a bit more about the data process that we've been going through since our last meeting.
I mean, I will take a pause for a second because Sam, I think you've covered a lot of good information. So if there are any questions, I know we are covering a lot of information. For any questions, any concerns, comments, happy to take them now.
I got a question. This is Tony Zamora with BP Travel Centers of America. And you mentioned a focus or maybe a bias on small fleets. Can you tell me why was the survey focused more on small fleets rather than large?
I don't think it's a bias as much as we're trying to reach establishments, and there are many more small fleets than there are large fleets. When you look at the number of trucks that are operated by large versus small, it skews the other way, right? So you get more trucks for the large fleets. So we're trying to be representative of what we see on the field, Tony, of the number of establishments that we see. We may do some adjustments at the back end, but second part, right? Two answers. The second part also is we are thinking about public charging infrastructure. We're not thinking about private charging that happens on site in locations. Which tend to be larger establishments will tend to have more flexibility to do that. So from both of those perspectives, we try to capture a blended mix. And also, super difficult to get large fleets. My final point. If you know a good way to reach them, let me know. They tend to be so you never get a maker, right? All of these are
so Anurag, let me make sure I understand. So generally, not a bias, and you have a good representation both from large fleets and to small. But as I look at those like responses on bar charts, just like the last one, I should factor in, you know, you'd have to normalize that for number of trucks, but kind of. But then I do hear you saying maybe there is, you know, maybe we are missing some responses from large fleets because they're hard to share.
We may. So when we go to the next phase of the work that we see, Tony, we'll show you how we think the survey is providing a reasonable representation, because we also have the GPS data, which capture both large and small fleets. Are the two talking to each other? Are the numbers similar? If they weren't, then we would say, oh my God, we need to reassess. But the numbers look close, right? They're not perfect. They'll never be perfect, but we're getting it in the right ballpark. So
this is excellent work. Just compliments to the team. This looks great.
Thank you. I see Vicky has a question. How many individuals were surveyed? We surveyed 100 firms, or we got responses from 100 firms. Although Mark may have reached out to 10,000. Exaggerating, but response rates tend to be very difficult to get from the fleets that are very busy. At this point, I believe we have met the requirements of the study. If there are opportunistic information that we can get from the fleet operators, we still have 2 focus groups that we haven't completed, and Sam will talk a little bit about that later on. So there are opportunities, but for now, that phase of the project is complete. Sam, didn't mean to steal your thunder, but if you want.
No, you answered it perfectly. So we can move on to your covering of the data.
Why was the focus on class 3? It is class 3 plus. There's a typo. We fixed it in 2 slides, but the last one just says 3. It doesn't say 3 plus. So Tom, I was noticing that as well. That's it. I had made a note that we need to make that change. Good catch.
On me.
I'm glad everybody's awake after lunch. I'm super excited about that. Any other questions, anyone? Otherwise, we can jump to the next phase. Okay.
Just one more question in the chat was about why the focus on class 3 trucks, as shown in the slide heading.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, Jonathan. It's a typo. It is class 3 plus, not just class 3. So 3, 4, 5, 6, all the large trucks are in there as well. Thanks.
Yes, very few of them were actually class 3 trucks.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah. Mark, since you're on the call, thank you again for you and your team for doing an excellent work. I will say that it was extremely challenging. When we started the project, we were hoping to rely on some of the community groups, the truck community groups, which sort of mobilize. But there is a bit of tension with all of this legislation coming down about electrification and how the trucking community sees it. So Mark and his team actually had to navigate around what we felt was a bit of frustration building in the community, or a bit of questioning in the community. So kudos to his team to just pull it together both on time, but also to get a good representation from various fleets and fleet sizes. And Tony, yes, there will be a report. Sam will have that. It's up to SCAG how we'll work with Jonathan to figure out what we demonstrate to the tag, where the reports go. But yes, we do plan to submit all of that. Okay. If you thought the survey was challenging, now I'm going to get into some pretty detailed technical work, and also maybe some of you might find it esoteric. But I'll tell you that we consider both of these elements, the survey and the data, to come together, because ultimately it'll help us build better scenarios for what we want to test, because there's a lot of unknowns. We don't know how many, which fleets will electrify first. We don't know how much of the electrification will happen in the interim years, right? Everybody knows or understands what the end state is, but we are planning for interim years as well. And so it's critical to sort of triangulate and pitch all of these elements together. The summaries that Sam shared, which was also put together by my colleague Wesley, are critical in sort of demonstrating how different fleets are imagining when transitions will happen. There's also time horizon, which Sam showed as well. So a lot of different moving pieces come together. When we talk about the truck GPS data processing, we did procure a large sample of anonymized truck GPS data. It was 4 weeks over the course of the year. We chose each quarter because we wanted to have a representative sample, because we know that because of the port, patterns tend to be a little skewed at different times of the year. And also, we also are doing this effort in parallel with the statewide effort. And when we think of the statewide effort, there's a lot of agricultural movement, which is pretty seasonal as well, but it changes depending on the season. So we want to capture all across the year and make sure that this data are representative of what's happening. There are 4 key steps, and I'll try to cover 4, but there is 2A, 2B, 2C, 3B, 3Z. There's a lot of sub-steps as well, which I will not bore you with on today's call. But key elements are: get the truck GPS data, make sure that it's expanded to total populations and validated against other known trusted models and results, and then start identifying market segmentations, because different markets may adopt electrification at different stages. And then finally, electrification has an impact. The drainage of electricity has an impact whether your truck is full or empty. So we need to overlay these truck GPS data, because we only have movement information. It needs to be overlaid with the weight that it's carrying, because then it has an impact on how quickly electricity will be discharged. So those are the 4 key steps. Next slide, please. There are 2 categories in the data that we see: medium, which is 10 to 26,000 pounds, and then heavy duty, right, which is over 26,000. We'll have similar data in the survey as well, so we can sort of start matching the 2 together. As I mentioned, we had 4 weeks of data, whole bunch of trips, nearly 25 million trips in the medium duty vehicles, and then 3.5 million trips that we see in the heavy duty vehicles. These are unexpanded, unadjusted. This is what we see in the data. My colleague JJ, who's also on the call, led a team who did a lot of this work in pulling all of this data together. As you can imagine, large data sets, making sure that we are capturing them effectively. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to give a synopsis of what we hope to what we were hoping to get out of this and what we accomplished, rather than doing it as a summary slide. These GPS data help us understand where trucks are traveling over the course of 24 hours. It's important to have a time dimension to this, because when we think of electrification or fueling, it's not just what you did in the last trip, but what you did over the course of the day, because then you start saying, if the range is 200 miles, when did this truck hit 200 miles or 150 miles, right? So they're starting to think about fueling. Secondary to that is not just total travel, but when the truck stopped, where they stopped, and how long they stopped. Because this is not like just you going to a gas station for 2 minutes and filling up. This takes a little bit more time. So all of these elements are important as we start thinking about where charging locations can be sited. We are now in the process, as you saw when we said here are the 4 steps that we would do. There was one with an hourglass. We're trying to combine the elements from the survey, from the outreach, with what we see from the database to sort of link all of them together as we start identifying market segments. And then finally, all of these outputs that are validated, that are reasonable, feed into a simulation model that will be developed by Berkeley National Lab. It has already been developed. They've been working with CEC but it focuses mostly on electrification only. But we will add a hydrogen module because SCAG thoughtfully doesn't want to say, oh, we're only going to bet on electricity. It may not, right? So we need to understand the blueprint for both zero emissions charging. So we'll update that simulation model and then identify where charging sites may be identified. So this is sort of the synopsis of what we hope to accomplish. And it also sets us up for the next couple of focus groups when we start presenting results. Next slide, please. The trip expansion, you have a lot of truck trips that you see. They're not representative. They're a pretty large sample, but you see that there are certain parts of the state and certain parts in SCAG where there are no trucks or there are fewer than we would imagine. So there are some biases or unknowns in the database. So it's important to expand the truck trips to something that we expect to see on the ground. So we did it, we actually with Mark and also with SCAG in years past, and in other areas, we've done a lot of regional truck surveys where we actually go to the truck operators, similar to what we see in the database today, but we ask them how many, not just how many trucks you have, but how many trips do you make, right? And then tie it back to the number of employees that they have to get what is known as a truck trip rate, a trip rate per employee. So those are our targets, right? So we develop those from the surveys, then we apply them for the entire state and say, if there are 100 jobs in this particular zone, then we expect to see, if the trip rate is 2, we expect to see 200 truck trips coming in and out of that zone. So that's sort of the targets. And then all of this data that comes from the GPS becomes the internal cells of the matrix. So you have the row and control totals from the surveys, and then the cells of the matrix, and then you keep expanding them until you sort of adjust that matrix to match both the row and the control totals. Typically, when we do this expansion, when we don't care as much about electrification or making sure that every truck trip made by a particular trip has the same weight. It's very important to do that because we want to know whether there were 3 trucks that made trip A, trip B, trip B going between points A, B, C, D. We need to have the same weights given. So there's a bit of mathematical complexity in how the expansion needs to be done. And so we had to adjust a few different parameters as we did this expansion. So that's the first piece. Next slide, please. And then we start comparing how our results look against the statewide travel demand model. We chose a statewide model because, as I said, there are 2 parallel efforts, and we want to make sure that it represents not just the SCAG area, but the entire region as well. The HDT stands for heavy duty trucks, right? And then medium MDT stands for medium duty trucks. And you can see that we line up pretty reasonably well in terms of the total trips that need to be produced in either location. We do pretty well. In the heavy duty trucks, we also add some information about FAF, but I'll get to that in a second. So these are our smell tests to make sure that we are producing reasonable results to begin with. Next slide, please. And then we also do what is known as a network assignment. So we take these truck trips, we assign them to a road network, then we have traffic counts, truck traffic counts on various locations of the roadway and say, how are we matching against these observed counts? And then there are known standards in the travel demand modeling community about what this error needs to be and what the root mean square error needs to be. So a lot of checks, and you'll see we're comparing our performance against known standards, which is the last column, but we're also comparing against how are we doing in relation to the statewide model, which also has been validated. And in most cases, you will see that the first 2 columns were pretty close to the statewide model. And I would say in some cases, we're actually performing a little bit better, like the expressways. And in every case, we're below the threshold for what that relative error target needs to be. So again, this was a second check to make sure that our results are reasonable. We're putting the trucks consistently across the state. We have the right trip distribution dimensions, because all of these are important. We don't want to make blueprints without having confidence about how the underlying data looks. Next slide, please. And then we start looking to say, well, what market segments do we see? We want to develop market segments based on where the trucks are traveling. Are these port trips? Are these going to large warehouse locations? Are some of them stopping at parking sites, which means they either take advantage of rest areas today, they're fueling up at some of these parking site locations, or they're staying overnight. Like, these are all important characteristics, because then we say, oh, this market segment may be ripe fortifying some of our public charging infrastructure versus others who may not be, right? So that's the market segments that we're building with a truck type. And then we look at the daily travel patterns. These are important as well. How many miles are the trucks traveling? If a truck is traveling, let's say, only 50 miles over the course of the day because they're doing a lot of local deliveries, they may say, I don't need to do public charging, or I don't need to do charging during the course of a day. I may do it at my site. So all of these pieces are important, and they're all defined in our market segmentation when we summarize the data. And then as we start imagining the future scenarios, we could say, well, what happens if 20% of port trucks are electrified? What happens if 50% of port trucks are electrified? What does that change? What does that mean in terms of where the sites could be sited and how much demand is generated, right? How much electricity do we need? So these are the different ways. Again, I wish the truck GPS data came with a lot of classification about how much commodity is carrying, what market segment it is, whether it's a large fleet, small fleet. It's impossible to get all of them, but we try to back into it by doing this technical work. Next slide. That was the easy part. Now is the more complicated element, which is, okay, now we have allocated the truck trips on the roadway. Fantastic. Now tell me, what commodities are they carrying and how much weight is being carried by each of these trucks? There are two sources of data. One is there's the freight analysis framework, which is done by the federal government. The PTS actually releases it. The FAF is actually done at a very large zone level, right? So I believe there are 5 or 6 zones for California, not more than that. So we took the FAF and disaggregated at a county level just to make sure that we know how trips are distributed or commodity should be distributed within the state. And then we actually, Mark McCord and I supported Caltrans on what is known as the California Vehicle Inventory Use Survey. This survey was much larger scale, but it answers some key questions, which is what is the average payload being carried on trucks by commodity type? And then also get some information about the empty, partial, and fully loaded truck share, because these are important to capture as well, because not every truck is fully loaded. And about 20% of truck trips tend to be empty because they're going from dropping stuff off to picking at a different location or just going back empty to a home base. All of these are important to capture in our database because, again, they have an impact on discharge rate. And then now we have to link the two together to say, well, what do the commodity flows look like? Next slide. What you see on the left is just what the FAF database produces. The origin is our SCAG region, right? We took the 6-county region and said, well, what do the flows need to look like? What is the commodity flow that is happening between the SCAG region and all of these external regions? So that's what you see in the slide on the left. Then when we convert those commodity needs into the number of truck trips that we see, then we start to see how many truck trips are translated from those flows. And then the purple says, when we did the first round of expansion, how many truck trips are we actually seeing? So what you see is we got it right. We got it right on the volume, but we are missing, if you look at the very last row, which is MTC, which is the Bay Area, the number of truck trips that we are producing in our database is much smaller than the number of trucks that actually need to go to the MTC to serve the commodity needs. So this makes us say that, oh, we actually need to redo some of this adjustment with a specific focus on certain market areas and certain market segments to capture this more effectively. Next slide. And then we also started looking at some travel patterns. Sam, you presented something from the survey as well. So we'll start stitching together. But when we looked at these initial results after our first round of expansion, we said the heavy duty trucks, I cannot believe that if I have a heavy duty truck, 25% of the time it travels less than 25 miles, right? If that's a big part of my equipment, I actually wanted to be moving and carrying goods. So when we did the first round of expansion, whatever we did on the adjustment was skewing us more towards the shorter end of the truck trip table. And we said, this is probably not right. I would expect even more trucks of the heavy duty trucks moving to the long distance travel in terms of total vehicle miles traveled per day. Next slide. So then we did a couple of rounds of adjustments and we said the heavy duty aggressive expansion means I'm going to skew it all the way to long distance trips. Every long distance trips will be given a much larger weight. And I will try to fill that portion first, trying to meet the FAF commodity targets. And then I will backfill with just with the short distance travel, or something in between, which we call a moderate expansion to see how we do, right? So you can see that when we get the aggressive piece done, we're starting to pull closer to what FAF tells us in terms of the commodities that need to be moved between the two areas. So you start to see some of the changes. Now, again, there are a couple of reasons why we'll never be perfect. We took an average payload, but when you're traveling long distances, you tend to carry more heavier loads, and that distribution doesn't line up perfectly, right? You're probably taking maximum payload every single time, and you may be an oversized, overweight truck sometimes because you just don't want to do that trip back and forth. So there are some reasons why we'll never get the long distance 100% right, but the goal is, are we moving in the right direction to make sure that all of these different travel patterns are captured effectively for SCAG, and we'll do similar checks for other parts of the state as well. As you can see, both the moderate and the aggressive skew us away for the short distance travel, but try to pull us closer for the long distance travel. So we may choose a fourth method that sort of balances this a little bit more and try to do the adjustments at a slightly different level than the way we have done. So we're maybe a couple of rounds away, but we wanted to be open and transparent about some of the challenges that we are seeing and some of the methods that we are doing. So everybody, all of you, it's important that all of you and all of us feel comfortable with the technical work that has gone into developing what will be the next phase of this effort. Next slide, please. And you can see some of these variants, right? Which is, once we did the adjustments, you can start seeing that for the heavy duty trucks, we tend to have now more truck travel, which shows more mileage as opposed to the 0 to 25 miles that we saw before. So the blue bars were the initial, and then as we start doing the adjustments, we see that the blue bars are dwarfed by the longer distance that we see in the other two expansion methods. So again, these are sort of the critical steps that, again, JJ has been leading a lot of this effort, but it sort of shows all of the work that we have done to get to a point where these results look reasonable. I know I throw a lot at everybody. I hope it made sense, and I hope you were able to follow along. But if there are questions, I'm happy to take a couple now.
Anurag, I want to note there is a question from James Schenkel in the chat about weighted trips in the context of counties.
Regarding the weighted trip information, context of trips. That's right, James. We do see a lot of truck trips that go to both sides. JJ, is this something that you want to answer? I know you've had a little bit more time than me to look at the chat.
Yeah, I think I get the question if it's, counting both trip ends, starting and ending in the same county. But here we're counting one trip end, meaning a region of that. We see slightly unbalanced for each county as expected, but in the same ballpark for both outbound and inbound at a county level.
And we capture both internal and internal. We capture internal to external. We also capture in the truck GPS database trips that start in California and go elsewhere in the country. As long as it touched California over the course of a 24-hour database, or the 24-hour period, the week-long period, we do capture that information about that device in our database.
Looks like we have a question from Tony. Tony has his hand up.
Yeah, again, this is excellent, and maybe a remedial question, but if you could just touch on the sources, right, for the GPS. Like I've seen some like private things, Geotab being one, service that provides. Are these public data sources that you're pulling from, or where do these data come from?
Yeah, these are commercial data sources. SCAG does have a license for Geotab data, but for this study, we actually wanted more raw GPS data so we could build a 24-hour pattern, which doesn't exist, I believe, in the contract that SCAG has. So we went a slightly different way to get access to that. But it's again a commercial data source, very similar to Geotab, Tony, to get all of this information.
But so there are other similar companies or services that they're providing the telematics, and it's all aggregated and everything. But and you have high confidence, of course, and that it's a good representational cross-sectional of everything. Do you think there were any gaps in there of fleet types, or?
There are always gaps. right?
Yeah,
And the part with the anonymized data is you actually don't know perfectly, and
Yeah.
the vendors like to keep it anonymized for the reasons of privacy. So some of the checks that we did is exactly that. Do we have enough truck trips across the state of California? Or are there certain counties that are not represented at all? Are the trips traveling to the places that we would expect? The Inland Empire, the ports, both ports, right? Bay of Oakland as well. The Port of Oakland, sorry. Are we seeing enough truck trips at all three ports? Are we seeing a lot of truck trips happen in places in urban areas? We need to see more medium duty trucks, right? Medium, small duty trucks, which are delivering elements
Yeah.
first in last mile or middle mile. So we're seeing all of these elements. Are we capturing them? And we see a lot of these signing the yes box. Now, I don't have a sense whether it needs to be 102 versus 145, but am I seeing them exactly in the right areas? We do. So those are the kind of smell tests, Tony, as we were describing our steps, we saw that.
Right. Well, excellent. Thank you.
Have I bored everyone to sleep? Any other questions? Okay. Sam, I'll turn it back to you, I believe, to start
Yes.
wrapping all of the phase one work for us.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Anurag, and I hope everyone's still awake. We're about to move more into our engagement portion of the presentation today. What I'm going to cover right now is kind of the feedback we've received, or I should say the input we received or information we received during our focus groups and interviews that we conducted. Again, the 3 focus groups and 11 interviews. We found some important themes that kind of ran through almost all of our interviews and certainly through all 3 of our focus groups. So we're going to cover these high-level themes. We're actually going to ask some questions regarding them as part of our engagement piece of this. So, Lars, if you go to the next slide. So one of the first themes that we heard when we went through this engagement process was funding. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. The high costs of the zero emissions vehicles, the high costs of the infrastructure related to them. And we saw that come up not only in the survey, but obviously within interviews. That was cited multiple times as one of the biggest challenges funding the overall cost of the transition. And then the next one that we heard a lot about was actually the availability and the capacity of the grid and the availability of those locations where electricity could be supplied and the challenges of getting electricity there. Additionally, we heard those same types of challenges, not only about locations, but also just the overall availability of hydrogen. So being able to where you can charge, the locations and how much it costs to get things there were the biggest elements in terms of electrical grid capacity and hydrogen that we consistently heard through each of our engagements. And the next conversation that we had heard a lot of is the difference between public and private, the challenges that each of them face and why each of them are important. A lot of that was pointed out to us that smaller fleets are going to need access to public charging stations, and to have this be a fully viable tool or the fully viable electric future or energy future, we're going to need public charging facilities, not only for small trips, not only for owner operators and people who don't have private depot options, but also just to complete trips to ensure that there's charging capacity on the grid throughout the distance of the trips to ensure that there's redundancy within the system. So there was a lot of emphasis on the challenges that each of these types of charging setups were going to have, but there was a big emphasis on the need for the public charging facilities. The next big one we heard were timelines. So there's been a number of diverging timelines that were pointed out to us, especially in the interviews, where they focused on this disaggregated timeline between where people within the utilities industry are and where transportation is. So they're on two slightly, or I shouldn't know if they're slightly, but significantly different timelines. Additional timeline issues that were pointed out to us were streamlined timeline issues for permitting, the CEQA process, and other regulatory hurdles that each of these companies had to go through in order to get charging stations installed. Additionally, we heard of a number of timeline issues where trucks or vehicles would be delivered and the charging infrastructure wasn't able to be built. And so they had trucks sitting on site unusable, but we heard that multiple times come up. So there are some significant timeline issues that also need to be addressed. And then the last one we heard significantly more within our focus groups was the equity of locations. This was also brought up in multiple interviews, but ensuring that already disadvantaged communities don't bear the full burden of having depot charging, or I should say open or public charging locations because you think it's easy to install there, but making sure that we are thinking about the equity, making sure we're not overburdening over already disadvantaged communities or underinvested communities. So we want to ensure that we are thinking about equity and thinking about how that might be taken in as a factor when we're thinking about where charging sites can be, and even thinking about that in terms of the design of charging sites, ensuring they're context sensitive and that they consider the impacts to the communities they're going to be installed in. So at this point in time, Lars, I'm going to transition this over to you to start going through kind of the overall solicitation and the engagement pieces. So I hope we haven't bored everybody to death yet. So I'm really excited to hear your responses to some of the upcoming questions and poll questions we have, and your overall conversation about what's going on from your perspective in the zero emissions charging vehicle world.
All right. Thank you, Sam. Before we get into the poll questions, I'd just like to point out a couple of comments that have shown up into the chat here. They're related to the themes that Sam just reviewed. Leslie shared that President Biden will announce Department of Energy Hydrogen Hub awardees this Friday. Fingers crossed for California and Arches. We have some responses to that as well. And then James Schenkel offers, regarding the theme of availability, whether grid or hydrogen, did respondents provide any information regarding the geographic context of their travel patterns? Generally or specific in the context of range considerations and or driver schedules?
When we talked to, at least in the interview section, there wasn't as much information in terms of respondents providing geographical context to their travel patterns when they were talking about the availability of hydrogen. That was more of an overall comment on the availability of the fuel and the challenges of getting it to locations and ensuring its availability as a fuel source throughout the state and throughout Southern California.
Do we lose Sam?
Specific to travel patterns, but certainly something that was brought up in the context of some of the longer term or locations that have more grade, where hydrogen may be more viable than some electric options, was brought up by a couple of our interviewees when they talked about the idea of potentially a mixed fuel future and ensuring that we looked at all different types of fuel types to ensure we're thinking about context when we're thinking about charging facilities and charging locations as well as hydrogen. So it was more of an overall comment, but people did bring up the viability of hydrogen in some locations and where it might be a preferred option when they're thinking about it in terms of some of the long-term travel or places where it might not be feasible for electric travel. So that was brought up a couple times, but more specifically, it was over to the general understanding of how available hydrogen was.
I'll also say that this is people's response to where things are today, right? So
Yes.
all of this information is great, but as we develop the simulation models, that as we start implementing those changes, all of this needs to be taken, I'm not saying with a pinch of salt, but we need to capture a range of variations around it. This cannot be a point, this cannot be the only data point, this cannot be the single point of truth. So our hope is, as we do the simulation, as I've said before, we'll capture a range of adoption rates, a range of different interests. So we at least see what this variability could look like, especially on demand, energy demand, the timing of the energy demand, and also the locations where these would be needed. So we'll hope to capture some of that at the back end as well by having sort of slightly larger and lower ranges.
Excellent. We have a follow-up question from Christy. Did any of the respondents say that they were looking at having liquid hydrogen deliveries rather than gaseous?
We didn't get that detail from any of our interviews or the focus group. They did say they're on the lookout for when liquid hydrogen would be more viable and more of a fueling potential option, and seeing how that differentiates from gaseous fueling for hydrogen. They, at that point in time, at least the people we interviewed, most of them didn't have a specific opinion about how the hydrogen would be delivered. We did talk to a hydrogen fuel developer who did talk about the potential benefits of having it be liquid versus gaseous for different reasons in terms of volume and by understanding how well it travels and how well it keeps within the system. So there are potentially advantages to it, but none of our respondents outside of the hydrogen developer was specific to liquid versus gaseous.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone, for those follow-up questions. We'd love to hear more from you. So we're going to pivot over to firstly a couple of polls, and then we'll have an open discussion on one of these poll questions. So the first poll question is this, and let me set up the poll for us. Okay, so which challenge is the biggest concern of those 5? Funding, in your opinion, funding, electrical grid capacity and engagement, public and private depots, timelines, and equity of locations. All right, very good. Okay, I think everyone has, no, we're still waiting for folks to chime in here. I think that second option, incidentally, should read electrical grid capacity and hydrogen availability. That's an error in the option there. Okay, I see no more polling come in. We have about over half of you giving responses, and so I will end the poll now. This is your last few seconds if you would like to chime in and you haven't yet. Okay, still a few coming in. Very good. All right, there. I think now we have 60% participation. Fantastic. Thank you all. So let me end the poll now and share the results. And so it seems clear that funding, electrical grid capacity, and hydrogen availability and timelines are the primary concerns, and the grid capacity and availability of hydrogen definitely leading the way here. Among this group, at least those who have participated in this poll, none indicate that private versus public depots or the equity of locations is the biggest concern. All right, that is good for us to hear, and also probably good for all of you to hear from each other what your concerns are and what your priorities are. All right, so thank you for that. I'll stop that. We'll advance to the next poll question. Which of the challenges identified by stakeholders are you or your organization actively working on? And so let me now launch that poll. There we go. With the wording correct on that second option. So please take a moment and let us know what you or your organization is working on in relation to these engagement themes that we heard from our stakeholders. Okay, very good. We still have people chiming in. All right, there's been a bit of a pause. Oh, more coming in, very good, thank you. Okay, it's been about a minute. I'm seeing a pause in the responses, so I'll give you all about 5 more seconds for any of you who want to make sure to get your response in there. There we go. Fantastic. Great. Okay, I'm sensing that we're done here. Thank you. About half of you responded to this. Really appreciate that. And I'm going to end the poll now, and I will share the results. All right, and there are the results. So 10 of you are working on the funding side. 10 of you are working on the electrical grid capacity and availability of hydrogen side. 7 of you working on public versus private depots, 6 of you each on timelines and equity of locations. I think that speaks partly to our success in bringing together a TAC that is attending to the various dimensions of the issues that the SCAG-ZETI study is concerned with. So thank you for that. Sam, did you have any comments or thoughts about these results?
No comments or thoughts right now. It just is pretty reassuring to see that we have people working on some of the biggest challenges that we identified, both in the engagement, but also within our survey. So good to know that we're starting to work on these very large challenges and that we have a group of people who can speak to them in a really important way. And so I'm excited to hear during the open conversation a little bit more about some of their experience with these different barriers and challenges.
Yes, excellent. I completely agree. And I see in the chat that we have a few chats here. So we've got a comment from Akiko and a comment from James. And I say let's start with those. I can tell you that our next question actually relates to those answers. So I think those are a perfect segue to pursuing this larger, broader question, just an open discussion. Which of the challenges identified stakeholders do you think is the biggest concern? We wanted you to be able to elaborate on your answer to this question. And those elaborations are starting to come in the form of the chat. So let's begin with the chat comments while the rest of you consider an elaboration on your answer to this question as well. So first we hear from Akiko, who says, I've heard some larger fleets installing microgrids on site that are powered by natural gas to meet the energy needs to charge their vehicles while they wait for grid capacity to increase. Do you know what use these fleets may have for the microgrid units after the grid capacity gets updated? I'm curious if return on investment on these microgrid units makes business sense. I know that we heard when we were doing interviews and the focus groups, there was some conversation about these interim solutions, these kind of transitional solutions, and even some debate about them. So I can tell you that this has been a topic that has come up. I cannot speak specifically to your question. However, maybe Sam is able to elaborate on my answer.
Unfortunately, from our interviews and the focus groups, there wasn't a specific statement on the microgrids on site. There was the conversation about having them and utilizing them, and what that would mean for at least their short-term future. There was no elaboration on what happens after energy capacity came on site. It was only discussed, as Lars alluded to, as an interim solution to the timeline issue that some of the agencies or firms that we were talking to were experiencing with their on-site depot charging issues in terms of getting power on site.
And because this is an open discussion, if somebody among the TAC has a more specific answer to Akiko's question, that would be terrific to hear. And I also want to just note that your questions are important for us and are incorporated into our understanding of the issues and into the data. So even if we don't hear an answer, the very asking of the question is very important. So thank you, Akiko.
I could share a bit of our experience with our microgrid, which we're building in Ontario, at our Travel Centers of America, Ontario truck stop. It's small, right? So maybe, you know, and it's solar and it's a large battery and it's a hydrogen fuel cell. This is our pilot demonstration project, but and so it doesn't really relate to what I think you're saying, Akiko, about, and I can see it, you know, a natural gas generator to kind of tide you over for a few years till the great. However, just in our case, I know, you know, we aren't thinking of it as a temporary. It's basically the economics work out when you're able to peak shave, right? So that at the high demand rates of the local utility, having a large battery, generating our own power with solar, all of that, you know, pencils out, the economics work. You know, a natural gas fuel cell, or especially a hydrogen fuel cell, the economics are more challenging. But you know, it's one thing to look at like a temporary economic tide over and does it pay for itself? But I think that also, I think that we can make a case for long-term investment in microgrids.
Hey, Tony, just to follow up, we talk about using natural gas, or in Akiko's question, like how does it tie into the whole concept of clean fuel and zero emissions? Like, does that come up as you start thinking about the microgrid aspect at all?
Well, so in our particular case, we're not looking at a natural gas fuel cell or a generator. You know, as we do look at it, and this is a general open question for anybody, I guess I'm understanding, or maybe starting with the assumption that, especially in Southern California, you know, even hydrogen, you know, but in an internal combustion generator is a non-starter because it's not zero emission, right? It's producing NOx. And so a fuel cell, however, and so a big difference between a natural gas generator, of course, compared to like a natural gas fuel cell, which is a lot more expensive, but much lower emissions, not zero, but lower. But so all I can say, Anurag, is just in our case, we're looking at zero emission solutions for our own microgrid.
Thanks, Tony.
Right, thank you. Okay, following up, so James Schenkel offers a couple of comments. So the first is equity of location should be considered a fundamental or baseline component or consideration of any all efforts regarding alternative fuel infrastructure efforts or transition to ZE vehicles overall. This is a perfect example of an elaboration on this first poll question. James making the case for equity of locations is a high priority. We have somebody else who has supported that, or Anurag has supported that comment or acknowledged it. Love to hear others chime in on that question. And James also asks, would it be possible to identify the number of charge ports that will be operated and the charging capacity of each?
Yeah, you know what? Am I still muted? No, sorry, I was typing a reply, but quicker just to say, yeah, because we are public, you know, in partnership with the Energy Commission. So I'm free to say, we will be installing, our current design is 2 350 kilowatt chargers that are dual ports. So we could simultaneously charge 4 trucks there. Plus, we're excited to say, a megawatt charger, MCS unit. And then we'll have, kind of a small 250 kilowatt solar array, a 1 megawatt hour battery, and a small 80 kilowatt hydrogen fuel cell. And sorry, we'll be operational by perhaps this time next year. I'll say end of 2024. Groundbreaking is in March.
Very good, excellent response. I love the dialogue. Okay, Matt has his hand up. Yes, Matt.
Hey, thanks. I just want to acknowledge James' comment regarding equity, but I'd also like to make the comment that it'd be great if SCAG and maybe some of the other local agencies could weigh in, because some of the, and I know the state is looking at everything through an equity lens. However, oftentimes they're just using the domicile zip code as a checkbox for that's, that then qualifies as a DAC, a disadvantaged community. However, just putting an asset in a disadvantaged community does not always benefit the community, right? So for example, putting a big hydrogen refueling station in a disadvantaged community is not likely going to improve their air quality, because you're going to have more congestion, you're going to have deliveries, et cetera, et cetera. So just would urge SCAG to be thoughtful on how you address this equity situation, because just putting it in the community doesn't always necessarily mean it derives its benefits. Thanks.
Terrific comment, Matt. Thank you for that. We do have SCAG folks here. This is a chance if any SCAG folks would like to address Matt's comment.
This is Annie. I can chime in. I 100% agree with Matt. I think there are many dimensions to equity as we're looking at site locations, right? We don't want to create unintended consequences. And so most definitely, I think there needs to be sort of a broader look at siting locations and looking at just broader aspects of equity. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'll say just a corollary to Matt, what you said, and Annie, what you also described. There is also a safety angle, especially when you think about large truck charging facilities and what that entails. We don't necessarily want large trucks to come into these communities. So how do we capture those pieces and still identify sites which are close to the interstate, close to whatever typical locations are? There is that piece as well, which becomes far more important when we start thinking about truck charging than we think about individual vehicle charging. So that's one piece. I'll also put in a plug to the parallel CEC effort that's going on. That I believe there are a couple of our colleagues on the main contract from EPRI and CalSTART. I see Elizabeth at least was on for a little while. They, as part of the larger study, which is sort of parallel, tied together, they are engaging equity stakeholders as part of their own special technical advisory committee focused on equity. So again, we'll hear a lot from that community as well about things that work, don't work. So as we start tying all of these pieces together, I think we'll have a little bit more diverse opinion, important voices that need to be heard. I think we'll hear their opinion as we start building out the blueprints. So great discussion, but yeah, I just wanted to at least remind everybody of all of the other pieces that are going together.
Thank you, Anurag. Appreciate that. We have a comment from Steve Smith. The extent to which this transition succeeds will ultimately depend on the economics, as Tony was referring to, particularly the total cost of operations. Will this study look at the TCO and how to help the ZE truck world become self-sustaining? And how much interim funding may be needed to get us to that point? All right, emphasizing the funding theme that we heard from our stakeholders. So do we have a response? Anurag or Sam, any thoughts about will this study look at total cost of operations and how to help the ZE truck world become self-sustaining?
We will do a little bit on the economics, not a whole lot, when we talk about site selection and what it would look for different types of sites on the infrastructure side of things, right? But not necessarily the operational element of it. I think we're looking more at a capital pieces. I wish my colleague Sam Ponazeri was here from ICF, but we will pass this question to Sam to figure out all of the pieces they're coming to they're coming to help us out in the next phase. Steve, we'll get back to you after this meeting.
Right, terrific. Okay, we have another comment from Christy, and then we have Daniel's hand up. So first the comment. Christy says, regarding charger nozzle counts, if you hover over a project and it is a public project, that information should be available on the Energize map, and then a link is supplied. There's a resource there for you. Okay. Thank you for that. And Daniel, your hand is raised. What would you like to say?
Sure, just a quick note supporting Anurag's response on the total cost of operation. The literature review and research we've done indicates that the total cost of operation at this point is nothing you can pinpoint with any confidence. Almost all of the factors that go into the TCO are subject to a wide range of estimates at this point. So there's a big question mark about the TCO.
Hey, sorry, can I just chime in and ask a follow-up, Daniel? I agree totally. As a trend, and maybe as a comparison, I wonder what you think. As I look at, well, here's the assumption I'm starting to formulate. The TCO must be trending downward. And then if you look across at like the point at which, the TCO, what it looks like for the US, my assumption is, does that TCO reach parity with a diesel truck sooner in California than in other states in the US?
My guess is yes, because the diesel price is higher in California than in other places. But the whether or not it's trending downward is unclear. At this point, we don't know what the cost of power is. We don't know what the charging rate is. We also don't know what the cost of chargers and installation is. And we really don't know what the cost of the trucks is. The truck, heavy duty EV truck cost, depending upon your estimate, and ranges from $150,000 to $600,000. So all the factors there are, all of them have huge question marks.
I hear that. All fair points. Yeah, right.
And the trending downward, I think, is a good assumption that the things that are very costly now are probably going to be less costly in the future.
Yeah.
But trying to draw that curve with either end unknown is pretty tricky.
No, good.
I want to be sensitive to time. Great discussion, but I think we have 5 minutes remaining, and perhaps we can close. You know all of our contacts. Feel free to reach out to anybody, but Jonathan, Lars, if you want to move forward for Jonathan and me to close.
You bet. Absolutely. And thank you, everyone. Just want to note that we have additional comments in the chat for you all to take a look at. So yes, let's move toward our conclusion here. All right, so that was an elaboration on that second question. This is a last chance for any other input you might be able to supply for our project team. So even if we're not able to really have this discussion as time is drawing to a close, we would like to know if there's any information from today's presentation that will be helpful for any upcoming grants, right? Or what other ongoing efforts and coordination needs should we know about? So please take those thoughts or those questions to mind and let us know if you have some answers to them. Tony, yes, your hand is up. Go for it.
Well, all of this is all useful. So thank you again. This is great, and I think all of us working out here have been thirsty for such. I guess I'm a little unclear on next steps from this point, and
you have a next step slide.
Oh, okay. I'll shut up then. Cool.
All right. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So we'll move on. Okay. So we do have a next step slide. We wanted to bookend our questions. We started the meeting asking you with in one word, how are you feeling, or what were you hoping to gain from this technical advisory committee meeting? In a lightning fast way, let us know in one word in the chat. How are you feeling now? Did we succeed in gaining clarity or giving you an update and so forth? We want to see the chat light up with single words here. Informed, excellent. Succeeded. This is good, positive feedback. Excited, it's wonderful to hear. More, says James. Thank you. There is more coming. Very good. All right. Heated a little. Nice work. Thank you. Right. Okay. Super. Satisfied. That's excellent. I'm very, very happy to hear that. Any others?
I'll say it's more than a word, but I'll say it's critical for everybody on the stack to work with us, ask us questions. We want you to probe us, because the success of what we do later depends on all of us buying into this and saying, yeah, this is what we need to do for a region. There will obviously be offshoots. There will always be different programs that we are not imagining today that will make us go in different directions. But if we can go together in one uniform direction, I think it'll be fantastic. Yes, there are challenges ahead, but we can do it if we're all working together. So that's super important for us. So we're glad for your participation.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. All right. So next steps, take it away. Anurag.
We're still focusing on finalizing the literature review, the focus groups, and all of these pieces. We will save 2 focus groups for later. Somebody asked us the question, will we get some more information from some specific market segments? I think we want to save a couple of these focus groups because we also want to go back to the people that we spoke with and say, hey, here's what we have come up with. What do you think, right? So go back to the practitioners and have a slightly different take rather than asking them questions about where things stand and maybe making them react in slightly different ways. We will continue to convene the technical advisory committees. As I said in the beginning, there are 4 more meetings. The next meeting will start to transition away from, hey, here's what we have seen in the data, to say, here's how we are applying it, to start identifying sites, locations, the blueprints, right? This is all, we're going into the implementation side. Well, it's not pure implementation, but taking all of this data and actually translating into actionable outputs, I would say. And a lot more technical work to come. So be prepared. It's a marathon. I'm going to pepper you with all of this technical work in addition to the policy and the group activities. But those are pieces that are coming together. We plan to have 2 advisory committees between now and January. So I know schedules will be hard. We'll try to work around schedules. We will not have it on Christmas Day, I promise you, or New Year's Day or Thanksgiving Day, but it may be the day after. So we'll try to work with schedules, but these are important and things are moving rather rapidly. And we don't want to delay this because the sooner we come out with a blueprint, the more it'll help us in this rapidly evolving field. January 23. If I could go back in time, yes, I would do this study 4 years ago and would be better prepared before this change is happening in front of us. But again, I'm super grateful. Thank you all for participating. I'll turn it to Jonathan to help close us out.
Thanks, Anurag. So once again, just wanted to reiterate that, I'm really looking forward to being part of this study. My contact information is there. So any questions, comments, you can reach out to me. And, if it's something that I need to pass along to the Cambridge team, I'll definitely do that, or I'll answer myself. Again, I want to thank them for putting this TAC meeting together and presenting and answering all your questions, and really enjoyed some of the dialogue that we did have, and keep them coming, right? I mean, if you're asking questions that we haven't thought about, that's something that we can start incorporating into future steps in the study. So just want to thank everyone again, and we'll see you at the next TAC meeting. We'll be getting the meeting materials and reporting up on the website as soon as possible. We'll let you all know.
Terrific.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Good work.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.